Hello, welcome to the Toon Under Pod. I'm Jack, and with me today is Bobby and Dimi. How are you two boys?
Going well, mate. How are you?
Have you recovered from staying up until 4 a.m. to watch the Cambridge game?
I recovered today, actually. I just got my bearings again and wasn't so shattered after the loss. But not the result you want at 4 a.m. To stay up for and try to find a stream as well. It wasn't easy. So, thanks to lads for a great performance. That was great.
Wasn't good, was it, Dimi?
No.
Oh, it was great. I was looking forward to staying up actually and just watching a nice FA Cup afternoon. And we're playing League One, sold out. Eddie Howe, we're playing differently, and then the old cup set happens to us again. But what do you do? I couldn't sleep actually after the game. I didn't sleep till about 5. I had to listen to the talk back on BBC Newcastle. I found a stream and just had to listen to some of the callers talk in and just try to talk through what on earth we just watched. But another week, another great cup result.
When we did the preview, I didn't actually think that we were going to lose. We were all laughing, saying, because we did a preview of the previous FA Cup games, and I was like, nah, surely not. But yeah, that's the way it goes. Newcastle United.
Add it to the list. Add it to the next year's FA Cup special. This is another one.
So we also have a special guest today. So joining us from 10 hours ago, and yes, I am going to use that joke every time we'll have somebody from the UK on, is Chris Waugh, former Chronicle and current Athletic correspondent. How are you doing, Chris?
Yes, I'm very good, other than the result, still digesting the result from Saturday, and also quite sleep deprived because it's been a very, very busy month, which is different for me when it comes to a January window. But I'm enjoying that. I'm very much enjoying it, and hopefully it means that there'll be plenty of business done.
Yeah, you're obviously a very busy man at the moment, so we really appreciate you taking some time out of your schedule to talk to us over in Australia. So the plan for today is we're going to talk to Chris about a few of the many topical issues going on at Newcastle United at the moment. There's always things going on at Newcastle, but the last few months have been kind of mind-blowing even by Newcastle standards, so we've got plenty to get into there. But first, we're each going to ask Chris a couple of questions just about his general experiences and thoughts of being a journalist and a fan as well, of course, of covering this crazy football club. So I think, Dimi, you were first up with your questions, so off you go.
Yes, so Chris, probably the one question I always have for Newcastle supporters who also work as a journalist on the club is, do you find it difficult to not cheer or get too emotional, positively or negatively, towards the team in the press box during games? How do you balance that performance?
Yeah, I mean it is a very difficult one, and I wasn't sure before I came into covering Newcastle. I mean, when I wanted to be a journalist, but then obviously when I got the job first at the Chronicle covering Newcastle United, how that would sort of work. And I think every sort of person has a different approach to that. Every reporter has a different approach to that. And my personal approach and the way that I see it has always been that I have an advantage of having been a fan and someone who's had an association to the club and understands the history of it and everything that goes on and the emotional side behind it. But I also try to disconnect myself to a certain degree because I want to retain a certain level of objectivity. So I suppose one downside, don't get me wrong, I love my job and I love covering Newcastle United, but I suppose one downside is that I probably have diluted to a certain extent my sort of emotional connection, not in terms of it's still there, but in terms of I don't let it come to the forefront as much, and I try to put it out of my mind. And so during matches, it can be that there can be certain situations, particularly when it's been a particularly frantic game or it's a very important match, where emotions do come to the forefront. But in general, I think I'm quite good at sort of keeping it hidden below, and then I think that brings. I hope that brings a bit more sort of objectivity to an extent. There's always going to be bias and subjectivity in what I write because I write about Newcastle United and that's so I have to focus on Newcastle United anyway, and B, given my past with them. But I'd say I've become, at least for now, less of a fan in that sense. And I don't mean to dull that. I personally feel the need to do that to be able to, in my opinion, be better at my job. And so, but there have been a couple of situations where I have been emotional in the press. But I remember the Aston Villa 0-0 when Newcastle were relegated under Rafa Benitez. Basically, that game was huge, and just the frustration during the second half. And I struggled to contain my frustration during the second half, and Newcastle just couldn't do anything. And also, another one that springs to mind is the 4-3 home victory under Rafa Benitez against Norwich, where in that I mean, as a journalist, that was also chaotic because I was still working at the Chronicle and Journal. I had a really tight deadline, and Newcastle were losing 3-2 going into injury time, and I had to completely rewrite everything, which I was perfectly happy to do, but equally trying to control the emotions in that situation, trying to understand what was going on. That was chaotic. So yeah, that's a roundabout way of saying that probably I feel like less of a fan in that sense than I did previously, but that's out of choice as much as anything because I feel the need to do that to, in my opinion, be better at my job.
Have you ever actually jumped up in the press box though?
Jumped up? I don't think I've ever jumped up. I've sort of cheered and clenched my fist before. I don't think I've ever physically jumped up. I mean, there's also the sort of other side of it is because I mean, now working at The Athletic, I don't necessarily have to file things usually quote unquote as live. So it doesn't go out as easy. But certainly when I was at the Chronicle Journal, sometimes I was so engrossed in the fact that I needed to get things filed across that even if I felt that work mode would suddenly take hold again. And so no, I am quite good at being a little bit restrained in that sense. I've never really jumped up in the press box. I don't think. Not
like Andrew Musgrove then, because he reckons he's done it a couple of
times. Yes, I think he's a little bit wears his heart on his sleeve a little bit more than me, and when it comes to Newcastle.
That's what I was going to say, Bobby. We talked to Andrew when he was telling us about. I think it was when Matt Ritchie scored against Man City, the penalty. And he said, like, he jumped up and then he looked around and he was like, oh, shit. He realised. But it must be hard, like when you know all of that history as well and what it means to everybody to contain yourself. So,
but because there's also a weird sort of in sort of the what goes through your mind in terms of processing, because I have that sort of personal connection and the want for Newcastle to do well and the want for Newcastle fans to see Newcastle do well. But then also selfishly, if I just put on that hat as well, selfishly from a professional point of view, I want Newcastle to do well as well. And this is where you get the sort of accusations of, you wallow. I mean, this was the previous ownership used to have this issue in terms of the narrative around the club, and you want that to be negative. You want all this to be negative. So, well, actually, that's just couldn't be further from the truth. This club I want to see do well, and actually selfishly from a professional point of view, if the club is doing well, people are more interested, people are more engaged, people are going to read your articles more. And so that this idea that we just want constant negativity in the media could not be further from the truth, certainly for the local journalists up here. I can speak for every single one of the local journalists up here who covers the club. They want to see this club do well, and that's desperately what we all want.
Great answer, Chris. Probably this one's probably a little bit trickier because our history, obviously, since you've been covering the club, hasn't been great. Can you name what was been the most enjoyable game that you've covered as a journalist in your time, either at the Chronicle or now at the Athletic?
There's a couple. I'm going to pick a strange one in terms of the context of the situation, but one of them was Newcastle United beating Spurs 5-1 on the final game of the 2015-16 season, because it had been awful all of that season. It had been terrible, and obviously relegation had been confirmed midweek. I'd actually been at a dinner for the Newcastle Falcons, the rugby team, in the middle of the week when Sunderland had beaten Everton and condemned Newcastle to relegation that night, and then turned up on that Sunday, and the atmosphere within St James's Park and this sort of that energy that was generated, this willingness not to be defeated as a club, and the passion shown towards Rafa Benitez and the appreciation and determination, which eventually implored him to stay, and he did stay. Because of that, I thought that was just a unique experience, which I've never seen the like of at another club. And I think that typified Newcastle United. So that day in general, not just the game, more the day, that was very special. I thought that was an extraordinary occasion. Unfortunately, in the years I've covered the club, there haven't been any sort of massive highs beyond promotion. There haven't been sort of great victories in terms of Newcastle being top of the table or anything like that. But another one would be Newcastle beating Man City 2-1 as well, again under Rafa Benitez on a day which was huge. It was a strange day because basically news had filtered through that Newcastle were going to sign Miguel Almiron just before the match. So it was already busy in that sense, but it was they were coming up against the Premier League champions, a team who had been fantastic all season, and Newcastle's record at home against at home and away against the big sides at that point was really very, very poor, and they desperately needed it to give them a jolt in a relegation battle, which was looking increasingly precarious. And I thought Newcastle were fantastic all game, and thoroughly deserved to win. They fell behind very early on. Sergio Aguero scored, and yet the intensity and the way, it wasn't that Man City played badly. Man City played well, but Newcastle managed to overcome that. And so from in terms of seeing a performance of that level from a side who really were performing above their own quality, but to do that for a full 90 minutes and to overcome Man City, I thought that was a very, very enjoyable game to write on, and to see a Man City side playing well and yet be beaten by Newcastle was fantastic.
That was a funny game because here in Australia that was in the morning, so the games are either in the middle of the night or sort of first thing in the morning before work or on the way to work. And I think I said this before. I was on the bus on the way to work, and Matt Ritchie scored that penalty, and I'm sitting on the back going, yes, come on, get in. And everyone's like, what is going on here? What's going on with this weird bloke? And I had to explain to people, oh, no, it's all right. I had to say soccer so people understood. It's all right, I'm watching soccer. They're like, all right, okay. Everyone kind of shuffling away from me slowly. But that was a really big game. And Chris, maybe one day soon we might have another victory for you to talk about. That would be good, wouldn't it?
Well, it would be, only I'm not sure I've got the vocabulary to do so. I'm not sure how to write about wins anymore. It's one all season. Yeah, it's been quite. Actually, my one of our editors, David Jordan, who was a Newcastle fan, has been off on paternity leave for the best part of 5 months. So he went off before the start of the season. And he's going to return. At one stage, it looked like he was going to return because he's due back next week. He was going to return without Newcastle winning at all. They've won once, but they're going to have won once, possibly twice in the entire time that he'd been away on paternity leave, which is quite some record, I think, for 5 months.
What a football club, man!
It's embarrassing, isn't it?
What a club, yeah.
Bobby, over to you.
Chris, what's the weirdest experience you've had covering Newcastle United? Now, I know you work very closely with George Culkin, so you probably see a lot of weird stuff. But what, in terms of Newcastle United, what is the weirdest thing you've seen or covered or heard?
I mean, they're a very strange football club in general. So there tends to be some unusual sort of situation. And I'll tell you one, which was again the championship season, and there was a bit of a cock up at our end at the Chronicle in terms of who was meant to be working on us. It was a Sunday, I remember, because Newcastle had played, if you remember, played Nottingham Forest on a Friday night and away from home. And it was a very controversial match. There was sendings off, penalties all over the place. Yeah, Dummett was sent off, and there was 2 sends off, and I ended up working on the Sunday where I wasn't meant to be, but I was going to York with my family to like go to Christmas markets and various different things. So I was in the middle of York, and I'll be honest, I'd had a couple of mulled wines, and I received a phone call basically from quite a good contact, basically saying that there were certain people in and around Newcastle United who were sort of convinced that there was a conspiracy from the EFL against the club. Because I was told, first of all, they were going to appeal both red cards, which I was surprised by, although I think, if I remember correctly, both red cards did get rescinded. There was one which I just couldn't understand how they were going to get rescinded, but they did. But then, the second, and it was sort of like, so, do you think you want to write something along those sorts of lines, sort of suggesting them? And I remember I remember sort of asking them to repeat this, thinking, I've had a couple of drinks here. This is probably just me sort of imagining the situation that's going on. And then, no, it was sort of repeated to me again, sort of like, so do you think you'd want to write something along those? Like, do you feel the same? Do you want to write something along those? I was like, well, no, I generally don't feel that. I understand. There was a lot of conspiracy theories going around at the time. And I know that Newcastle, there was a lot of controversial decisions that season, and referees weren't up to a high enough standard, and Newcastle weren't getting the rub of the green. But I did not genuinely believe that there was a conspiracy against the EFL. And I wasn't going to write such a slanderous thing. So that was a very, very bizarre weekend where I just remember thinking it was just some old wine, but then having conversations later in the week which confirmed that I had indeed had those conversations already. So, yeah, conspiracies against Newcastle United trying to get promoted by the EFL. That's one of the weirdest.
Do you not remember that game against Burton in that season when we had there was that penalty, and it was like, what is going on?
Defensive penalty.
Yeah. Keith Stroud, I remember his name.
Well, that was another puzzle night because that was the first half, and I remember that game because obviously the press box at St James's Park is directly behind the dugout, and when the incident first happened, the linesman on the touchline didn't have a clue what was going on, neither the fourth official. And it was about a 5-minute delay when they're trying to work out what was going on. And Rafa Benitez asked one of the backroom staff members to go and get the rule book to be able to explain to the officials what it should have been. And so nobody knew exactly what decision had been given. And I remember all of us journalists spending half time trying to get in touch with the PGMOL, who basically are run the refereeing side of things to find out what the decision was. Nobody could clarify. There was about 4 different explanations were being given as to why the penalty had been disallowed, and basically it was just the whole thing was absolutely baffling. And then afterwards, obviously, had to come out and apologise because it was the incorrect decision. But yeah, that was I've never seen a situation like that where it was refereed incorrectly despite 4 different officials being consulted on the side of the pitch.
Jeez, what a shambles!
Yeah, that whole season was just stuff like that happening all the time, and you're just thinking, I never want to be in the championship again. I don't want to come down.
I think Rafa lost his mind from memory too, and Rafa usually wasn't one to really lose his cool. But I remember the cameras showing him after that, he just completely lost his head. He's thinking, what is going on where the officials do not know the rules? Like, how can you give an indirect free kick after the penalty? I mean, what on earth was going on? But yeah. We still won the game, I think, that day. I think it was 3-0,
yeah,
2-0.
It was 1-0. Richie scored. Richie scored as well, the winner, if I remember correctly. So
yeah, we don't have a trouble with Burton, unlike some
other
Enjoy Burton.
They're our bunnies, yeah.
And Chris, just a weird question. What would be something you could tell us that nobody has ever asked you?
Yeah, I had a bit of a thought of this one, and my answer's probably quite boring, but equally it's sort of, I think it sort of sums up where Newcastle United are as a club and where they sort of went to under Mike Ashley's time, and that sort of the press facilities at Newcastle's training ground. And nobody's really asked me about, well, how does it work in terms of press conference day? How does that work? And whereas at other clubs, and certainly by other clubs, I'm sort of talking about top half sides or the very best sides in the country, or ones who've invested in their training grounds, the likes of Leicester, who have very good facilities now, and Man City, where they have proper auditoriums for press conferences and the like. And at St. James's Park, to be fair, Newcastle have a very big area for the press, but historically they always have had that. But at the training ground, and obviously we're not going in the training ground at the minute, it's still Zoom press conferences and has been since the start of the pandemic. Hopefully that changes, because I don't think it helps anyone having Zoom press conference. I don't think it helps a manager. I don't think fans get enough from journalists from that, because I think it sort of dilutes the whole situation and makes it you further away from the club. But that's a by the by. But so pre-pandemic, and I assume post-pandemic, I haven't heard that anything's changed. At the back of Newcastle's training ground, there is what is called an indoor barn, which is basically where they train indoors. And then at the back of that, tagged on, is a room which has vending machines, which are sometimes forgotten to be switched off when TVs and radios are recording in there. And so they have to be good. So they have a loud sort of like whirring noise in the background. And then basically there are chairs which during the week, when the sort of academy games going on and other things when this indoor barn is used, that parents would come and sit in this sort of area, or may wait, or basically a drop-off area. And there is just there are desks like in a school brought to be put in front of advertising hoardings, which are put up behind. And then we as the media sort of sit around the back as the cameras are then crammed into the middle of the room, trying to get to the side of the vending machines. And then after the TV bit of the press conference, usually the manager would come in, there'd be a TV section of press conference. The manager would then leave, go into a separate room for radios, then come back. And us as journalists would have to reconvene the room, basically just move chairs into the middle of the room so that the manager had somewhere to sit and discuss with us what was going on. And that is exactly the situation. A club which has been in the Premier League for the best part of the vast majority of Mike Ashley's time there. And yeah, that was the situation that there was. And I don't mean that, I mean, this might come across as having sounding precious as a journalist covering the club, but I just think it gives that impression of everything at Newcastle United, that it's just, your manager should be, when your manager speaks every week, that should be a big event. That should be something which is in a proper environment. You should have a proper ability to have a press conference. This is an official communication. And instead, you're in a room which is basically bolted onto the back of an indoor barn, and then journalists themselves have to set up that room to try and have a press conference, sort of ad hoc press conference. It's all just absolutely bizarre. But that is the sort, I think it just typifies Mike Ashley's Newcastle and the state of the club that has been taken over by the owners, and the amount of work that needs to be put in to try and get them onto a level where they're even trying to be the likes of Leicester City or anyone like that, never mind Manchester City or Liverpool.
That's another reason for the journalists to be excited about the takeover, isn't it? You might get decent press facilities.
That would certainly be very nice. Yes, that would certainly be very nice.
Do you know if the Gallagher Pigeon's still there, Chris? The Gallagher Pigeon.
Good question. I don't know. It was there a few weeks ago. I haven't heard an update over the course of the last few weeks. So if anyone out there would like to let me know. I hope not, but I hope that has been changed. But equally, yeah, I'm sure it will be removed soon.
He's on Twitter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's on Twitter, isn't he?
There's a transfer rumor started by him, so he's around.
It's amazing that, isn't it, though, what Chris has just said there, because it's just so indicative of just neglect and a complete lack of care for the football club. So to me, these sound like easy wins for the new owners. You know, they can do things, put some money into it pretty quickly. I know they'll want to do a big, massive training facility in the end, I guess, with all the modern things, but it's just such neglect, and it's just so good that we don't have to have that anymore, you know, and that there's signs of change coming.
Oh, there's so many cliched sort of easy wins. I mean, they've made a lot already. Just even speaking to supporters, the fact that cleaning the windows obviously has become the joke.
That was a big one.
I think that was a big one. Although my understanding was I think that was going to happen anyway, but because it happened after the takeover happened, it's seen as this big thing. But then you have the likes of, I mean, a New Year's message was cheered to the rafters, and it's like, it's a New Year's. Why wouldn't owners send out a New Year's message? That just seems like a normal thing to do. So there are a lot of easy wins, and hopefully they continue doing them, but hopefully they also go above and beyond the easy wins and don't just let the sort of positivity and goodwill, don't just take advantage of that. They need to actually use that and channel that and actually make real progress, rather than just accepting what is always that any change that is made is going to be accepted positively. But I think they need to go above and beyond that and make sure the club right now is heading in the right direction.
I'm going to ask you, this might have changed from your time at the Chronicle and at the Athletic, but my question is, how do you find the balance between kind of critical, objective reporting and then retaining good access as well to the club and to the manager and the players? Because that must be a bit of a line that you've got to tread fairly carefully.
It can be a line. I mean, it is different at the Athletic to the Chronicle. Obviously, Chronicle, I was writing a lot more frequently. I mean, it was several articles a day, writing in a sort of different way, whereas I'm given more time to write things at the Athletic. There were obviously pinch points when I was at the Chronicle, and certain situations where, not just for me personally, but in terms of the way that the narrative about the club in the media and certainly in the local media wasn't well accepted by the previous regime, although we were on certain occasions also invited up for conversations with managing director Lee Charney, which I always found frustrating, which were good in one sense, but found frustrating after a while, because it was always, we would go up on the basis that, right, well, we want this to be on the record at some stage, and there's very little of that, and there was still a sort of cynicism towards that and a skepticism about what we would write. Actually, at the Athletic, until the takeover happened, we weren't. Relations between us and the club for a long while were not particularly very good. I think that was partly to do with Steve Bruce as well, and general criticism. Certainly, the last sort of 9 months, 10 months of Steve Bruce's time, I don't think it was just us, but with a few different publications, there was a very, I don't need to name them, I'm sure, but there were some issues with Newcastle United and others, and access was difficult, but access was difficult for just about everyone, to be fair, during Mike Ashley's time. There were certain periods where it was relaxed a bit. During Rafa Benitez's first 18 months in particular, there was all this openness, and partly that was because they were in the Championship and getting media coverage for them was a bit more difficult. And so certainly I was obviously working at a local at that stage, but national reporters were getting a lot more access at that stage. And then again, closed ranks once Benitez and the club started having their tete-a-tetes. But then over the course of the last 2 years, access has been minimal, non-existent. I mean, it was more than 2 years into my time at the Athletic. It was at the end of November that I finally got an interview with a player, and that was Joe Willock, which went up just, I think it was Boxing Day or just after Boxing Day that interview went up. That was the first time I'd been allowed to have a sit-down interview with a player at Newcastle United since I joined the Athletic, which was I started working for the Athletic. Well, the Athletic launched in August 2019. So more than 2 years down the road before we had a proper sit-down interview. There were certain times before the pandemic we got to speak to players in the mix zone, but that for me was astonishing, and I thought it was counterproductive for the club, because I never understand why you would restrict access in that sense. In terms of you have an interview, I don't understand why players aren't put up more. I know I'm saying this from a selfish media point of view, but to give them a personality, to have that feeling of fans, not just through an in-house club media sort of way, although they're great, and I think a lot of the interviews, particularly in the programme that the club do, are very, very good, but there is almost always a limit as to what the club can do internally. Whereas if you bring external journalist in to do that. Give them freedom to do it. It's highly unlikely that a journalist is going to then stitch you and the player up after that because and write it negatively, because then you just wouldn't give them an interview next time, and the player wouldn't be very happy to be in that sort of situation. So I never really understood that, but that is the past. Hopefully going forward there will be more access for a lot of us, and those interviews can be told. And yeah, the relations have been, I was going to say up and down in the Mike Ashley era. Most of the time down. There were a couple of ups. Yeah, there were a couple of ups here and there, but for the vast majority of the time, yes, I'd say that the critical friendship, as I like to think that the local journalists are, probably they certainly weren't seen as friends by the hierarchy at Newcastle United, the previous hierarchy at Newcastle United.
Do you hear stories from colleagues who cover other clubs about good relationships they've got and how they do that? Because it does seem like a classic case of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours sort of thing, doesn't it? There's a lot of mutual benefit here for the club and for the publication.
There is, and there are various situations like that, particularly sort of below the Premier League. I think you get it at a lot of different clubs where, again, it's maybe because they don't have as many sort of contractual obligations with the likes of Sky Sports or other rights holders, and therefore they want coverage as well. They want people, and so they'll give them that access. I have to be honest, it's not in the most Premier League clubs. I think or a lot of Premier League clubs, should I say, it's similar to the situation I've had at Newcastle. Maybe not quite as antagonistic in some circumstances, although I do know of a few other circumstances where it is. But basically, access is a lot more restricted than it was previously, and certainly at Premier League level, it's very difficult to build up those sorts of relationships where they see it as being mutually beneficial. A lot of clubs are sort of reluctant to do that, and it's a complete contrast to in the US. I mean, it was interesting at the start of the pandemic that when obviously in the US you have access to like locker rooms historically, and just go in and speak to players, which is quite the contrast to here. And it was basically the start of the pandemic. A lot of our colleagues at the Athletic across in the US were sort of getting advice from British-based journalists about how to write and to cover clubs when you don't have as much access as they did across there, because we're used to having far less access. And so that for them, the pandemic in one sense was a lot more of an adjustment than it was for us here, because we don't have as much access. We aren't as reliant on those sort of player interviews and the like. So yeah, it's a culture here. I think in the certainly on the continent, from anecdotal experience, that tends to be a lot more open as well, even at sort of top level clubs. Maybe it's not the very, very biggest ones, but at the top level clubs, I've had wonderful access when I've tried to speak to people in clubs abroad. And when you speak to journalists who cover clubs in France or the like, and they ring up and say, "Oh, can you put me in touch with such and such at Newcastle United? I want to speak to Alan Saint-Maximin," and they'd be like, "Well, you might want to speak to Alan Saint-Maximin, but they're not going to let you do that." Whereas if they rang up Lille, for example, and they'd let them speak to X, Y, and Z, or give them a good chance of doing so. So it's quite a different culture, unfortunately, and I don't think that benefits the clubs. I mean, I would say that, but equally, I don't think it benefits the clubs, and I don't think enough realise the potential power of opening that up a little bit.
You can give Sven Botman a ring and ask if he wants to join the team.
Exactly what I was saying, mate.
So that kind of feeds into my next question, Chris, which is it's about social media. So I'm interested in what is your take on the way football fans now kind of consume football through social media, and do you have kind of a particular strategy or like a thought out process that you approach social media with? Because you know that your voice, you've got 30,000 or so followers, but you know that your voice is kind of listened to a lot by the fans, and any little thing you might say is going to get picked up and jumped on.
Yeah, I mean, I am aware of that, and I don't want this to come across as if I think I'm sort of self-important or something like that. It's certainly not in that sense, but equally, I don't like to mislead people, so I don't like to put things on social media, or certainly not in my writing, but even on social media, I don't like to go to an extent where I would potentially mislead supporters, because I do realise that voice can carry the writing for the Athletic, that voice can carry weight, and so I am always. I do always give due thought to what I put out in social media. I do think that you can have a personality on social media, though. I do think that I can also show opinions within reason, or educated opinions from what I understand and from the knowledge that I have. And so I do think it's a very important medium. I think it's an important medium, and I also think this in terms of on the Athletic, both the comment section and when we do Q&As, to actually engage with supporters and subscribers and find out their views, because at the end of the day, that's what I'm trying to service. That is my job, to service subscribers and supporters out there and find out what is it they want to find out, what is it they're interested in, what are their opinions on certain issues or players or the manager or the way the club's being run. And so I think it's a very important medium in that sense. I am wary, and I realize I say this as someone on a solely online publication, but I am also wary of the fact that social media is not necessarily reflective of the entire fan base. I think that it gives, for the likes that I'm doing, obviously this podcast for you guys across in Australia, that it means that there's more of a connectivity between fans across the world, which there wasn't there previously. It was probably more difficult to be able to do that, but also sort of fans on the ground, both in Newcastle, rest of the UK, but also abroad, that some supporters aren't on social media and so aren't necessarily as reactive and emotional. Sometimes you have to step back, and I am always reluctant to necessarily jump headfirst into the immediate reaction after a match, because sometimes 12, 24 hours afterwards, when everyone's removed themselves away from the situation, then it doesn't seem quite as bad. Take Cambridge at the weekend, for example. The second half was appalling, and it wasn't good enough by any stretch. But there was a lot of emotional stuff, I think, out there. Some people suggesting that the players shouldn't play for the club again, and the likes of things like that. And I can understand why that comes out. But equally, if you think about it, 24, 48 hours later, even in a practical sense, that just doesn't work. But also in terms of, for me as a journalist, to just get caught up in that, I need to sort of take a little bit of a step back and think about how to present it. And sometimes it gets to a stage where you have to just be reflective of supporter views. And I feel on occasion I have done that to the annoyance of the club or certain people within the club, certainly in the previous regime. But that is my job. And so I think it's a very important barometer for some fan opinion, but I am also conscious of the fact that it's not every single supporter out there, and that there is a different audience to consider and also to service.
I've always been struck by the idea that actual match-going supporters, 50,000, I don't think that many of them are actually on Twitter, you know, like they don't necessarily go in it and use it. So that's why when you get things like Twitter campaigns for like managers out or something, it often doesn't translate into actual sort of action on a match day. Do you get that sense?
I think that can sometimes be the sense. I do know anecdotally. I know of a fair few who are on social media, but I also think that you have that situation that certainly during a match, if you're one of the 50,000 home supporters at St James's Park, the Wi-Fi and signal is so bad that you're probably not going to be one of the people who's on social media. So most of the reaction, the immediate reaction, right at that very moment in time, is not from the supporters who are inside the ground. And so that is something I also, you have to consider. And that's where you sometimes you don't get the same sort of vitriol maybe or negativity inside the stadium or inside away ends as you sometimes do on social media. But I don't think so. I think it's just there's so many different elements that have to be considered, and it can't be. I think if you're a journalist who covers Newcastle United or any other club, and all you're doing is basing your reporting and your opinions or what you are reflecting as the opinions of supporters on social media, I don't think you're doing your job properly, and I think you are ignoring other elements. So I think it's one crucial factor in how I approach covering the club, but it's not the only one. And I do, in my opinion, rightly give due consideration to other views as well, and other thoughts that people have, be they on social media or elsewhere.
Thanks very much, Chris. That's it for part one. And we'll be back after this to talk about Cambridge, unfortunately, and a couple of the other things that have been going on at St James's Park lately. See you soon. Welcome back to part two of the Toon Under Pod. We're very happy to have Chris Waugh of The Athletic with us here today. Chris, Eddie Howe's honeymoon period is now officially over. If he ever had a honeymoon period, I don't think he had much of one. How do you think Eddie is going to make sense of the discrepancy between the two performances against Manchester United and then a couple of weeks later against Cambridge at the weekend?
Well, that's a very good question, and one which will be interesting to see the answer to in the course of the next few days. But I do know that sort of in the immediate aftermath, I think there was surprise within sort of Newcastle's coaching staff as to the manner that Newcastle folded in the second half. First half, there could and should have been 2-0 up against 3-0 up against Cambridge. I don't think there's any question about that. If they'd had a striker on the pitch, I think they would have won. but they didn't have a striker on the pitch, and they're not going to have Callum Wilson for the next 8 weeks. Dwight Gale was absent, unexplained, although we know there's obviously been COVID cases and other issues. So I think people can put 2 and 2 together and work out what probably happened there. He may be back for this weekend, but even so, Dwight Gale has been overlooked by both Eddie Howe and Steve Bruce, not seen as being the answer to Newcastle's striking problems. So you will see that as unfortunate and something they desperately need to address in the transfer market. But equally, I think that he learned a lot about his players. Some players he maybe didn't know as much about in terms of in those matches when the going gets tough, that they don't have the answers, and that maybe some of them, the attitude was questionable. I know he came out afterwards and there was a lot made about the fact that he said he didn't have an issue with the body language or the attitude. I was in one section of a press conference. I don't know if he was asked directly about it by TV, but he offered it up of his own accord in the section of the press conference I was in, which to me, I felt was telling that he's actually come out and said that without being even asked about it yet, which I think says that it was at the forefront of his mind. And why would it be at the forefront of his mind? And so in some ways that may make it easier for him to decide going forward, or to have to basically say these are the players who I'm going to build a side around, but these players I can move on because I've seen the answer. I mean, it was a strong team that he named against Cambridge, but it was different to the one that was against Man United. I also think that Man United were awful. Man United were partly awful because Newcastle made them awful, but Man United were awful. But also I think that you saw the elements of the Newcastle side that are suited to sort of high press counter-attacking in certain ways. You can play on Saint-Maximin through the middle in that sort of environment. You can have the likes of Joe Linton works as a box-to-box midfielder, has become in that sort of situation where he's winning the ball and then just moving it on to someone else. Whereas against Cambridge, when you are tasked with trying to break down the opposition, you can see the lack of nous that Newcastle have in the final third, certainly during the second half, the lack of creativity, the lack of ideas. And Howe was known that was restricted to a certain degree, but I think that he and hopefully the ownership have now fully understand the depths to which Newcastle have plunged in that department and how desperately they need to address that. And so Howe won't panic. He's not someone who will suddenly throw everything out that he's been doing previously. He is building towards a new attempted style of play, which was always going to take time, particularly with the resources he had at his disposal and the history that was there previously. But I do think that he will have learned a lot about certain players that maybe he didn't realise before, and that maybe we saw a lot more under Steve Bruce during different points. Some players you can rely on and some you can't.
Do you think he has a problem trying to motivate players when, let's be honest, pretty much every player in the squad is not going to be here in 2 years, 2 or 3 years, apart from Kieran Trippier, obviously. Do you think he's got a problem trying to motivate these players, or do you think he's kind of relying on their professional pride, or do you think they want to be part of kind of an escape act that it's going to be now? Do you think he's got a problem there, and how do you think he's going to address that? Because you can't replace the whole team in January.
No, I think it depends on player to player. I think some of them there aren't those issues. I think with others there will be, and they will realise that the time's up, and maybe they thought the time was up previously anyway, and sort of it's just been that their contracts were extended or their period at Newcastle's been extended because Mike Ashley didn't want to spend to bring players in. So that there are those issues. I think there are also issues that some of the players who've come in weren't selected early on under Eddie Howe, but since injuries and COVID have taken hold, have suddenly come in, and then again they realise that, well, if these other players come back, will I be in the team? So I think there's that sort of issue there. I also think that there is a problem that he faces with the general fitness of some players coming back from COVID and the likes, in terms of how can you suddenly get up to that. And that's why I did think it was important he played a strong team on Saturday as he did, because I know a lot of people saying, oh, well, you don't want to risk injuries heading into Watford, but they didn't play for 10 days before Saturday's match. A lot of those players were absent also for the Man United game. That's a long period of time to suddenly go into what is probably now the biggest game of Newcastle's season against Watford, and they would have potentially been undercooked. So he had those sort of elements which were an issue from two. And so there are so many different strands to this. And I also think that the problem Howe has is the lack of wins in terms of convince. He's hinted at this himself, and that players will follow a manager, certainly a new manager, and his methods if it's working. And there was a lot of positivity internally at Newcastle when he first came in, but to build on that he needed to win games, and they've only won one match so far. And so players as we all do as naturally as human beings, that sort of confidence in the method and confidence in the ideas can't build. And Newcastle as a club have just forgotten how to win matches. That was always going to be the issue against Cambridge. Yes, they could and should have won on Saturday. They should have been going into Saturday expecting to beat League One Cambridge. But why should they expect to beat anyone? They've won one game all season. It's very hard to suddenly go from a team who loses or doesn't win every week to suddenly winning, even against lower league opposition. And this is the rut that they've got themselves into, and they desperately need to get out of it very, very quickly, because the next few games they need to win, and they need to win immediately, because if they don't win over the course of the next few games, then I do think that they will be done for, regardless of what they try to do in the window.
Yeah, we've been saying for a while on this podcast, the next game is the most important game of the last however many years. And it seems like every week the game is the most important game of the last decade or something, but the Watford game isn't it? We've been saying all along, we need to win, but we actually do need to win now. I agree with what you've said there, Chris. If we don't get, I think, at least 4 points from the next two games, I can't see how we're going to get out of it, really.
The reason that Watford, I think, is so important is, well, there's several reasons. First of all, for that, trying to build that momentum going into these run of games, but also just Watford in general. Watford are the team immediately above the relegation zone. They're 2 points in two places ahead of Newcastle. Any points that you concede to Watford allows them to either keep that gap or push even further ahead, whereas you can leapfrog them. And already it's looking like it may be 3 from 4. I still think other teams may drop into it, but 4 teams have been cut adrift at the bottom, and Newcastle and Watford are one of them. So if Newcastle can't beat Watford, then they only get 2 opportunities beyond that against those teams in and around them, and that's against Norwich and Burnley later on in the season. So they have to start winning these games. They have to start now. Burnley is the last game of the season, and the run into there before that is horrific again. So they've got to start winning. They can't just keep saying that it's coming, and they can't just keep talking about positive performances. And Howe himself recognises this and has touched upon it, and he knows they have to win, and they have to win now.
Yeah, spot on. I think it's we said it at the Brentford game, then the Norwich game. And I think it's got to a point where we're looking back already at these games and the missed chances. I think Chris was spot on about not knowing how to win, because we should have beaten Brentford. Kieran Clark blunder. We should have beaten Norwich, and I thought we battered them even with 10 men. So we're looking back at already this season at the missed chances, and it's not a good sign when that starts happening.
We're going to talk about we can't not talk about the transfer window, so we'll do that in a minute, Chris. But I want to ask you first just about your assessment of the owners, because when they came in, they were really kind of caught on the fly as much as anybody. What's your judgment of how they've done so far in what's been a pretty crazy couple of months?
I think that I think middle of the road. I think it was always going to be different. No matter who would have come in, it was going to be to come in the situation Newcastle were in and not have a transfer window immediately. I think was very, very difficult for them, and to not have had the manager lined up. And so it took them a while to get the manager in place. I think ideally they would have got that in sooner, but they were thorough in what they were trying to do. They didn't want to just appoint the wrong person. So I admire them for that. But ideally Eddie Howe would have had a bit longer to get sorted. Obviously, there was the situation with when they tried to get Unai Emery, that they did not get the first choice in the end. And so that is a negative point in that sense. But I think in many ways, Eddie Howe was possibly a better appointment than Unai Emery in hindsight, because he was available. He assessed the squad. He knew what he wanted to try and do with them. And yes, it may not have worked out yet, but I do think that he was possibly a little bit more suited to this stage of the quote-unquote project, for want of a better term. I think it's a frustration that they haven't managed to get the full setup in at Newcastle in terms of the executive structure. But again, I have sympathy for them because they want to get the right structure. They didn't want to just rush into putting in a structure and then decide further down the line it was the wrong structure to have in place. So given the pressing situation on the field, they ideally needed that sorted, but they are thinking about the longer term and about what is going to actually be best for the club in the future. And so they are looking for the right director of football, the right CEO to guide them through that process of what is going to be a very difficult process. Other than Man City, no club has really been through this sort of transition. It's different to Man City in the sense that Newcastle only had one director previously. Lee Charnley was the only executive level person they had at the club. He was the only person running anything. And so they have inherited a skeleton of a club which they haven't really been able to beef out to the certain extent that they want yet, but they wisely have brought in sort of outside help in the shape of Nicky Hammond, who is there as a consultant, advising them on certain technicalities to do with contracts and negotiations and the likes going into January. So I think that they've made a decent fist of a very, very difficult situation. But now this month is telling. And Kieran Trippier, I think, was an excellent sign. I think to get that done early was important. And I think it was a very astute first signing, because Newcastle get linked with so many players as soon as the takeover happens, and you think that they're going to chase a Hollywood name, and instead they've gone for a very, very good player, but someone who isn't just coming in because he's not wanted by Barcelona or something like that. He was wanted by Atletico Madrid. He's an England international. He started the Euro 2020 final. He immediately improves Newcastle in so many different departments. And so hopefully more signings follow, but I think that we learn a lot more about them over the course of the next few weeks and the transfers they can do in what is admittedly an extremely difficult window. It was described to me by one recruitment official at a different club as Newcastle probably facing the most difficult transfer window in the history of any football club, because of all of the unique challenges they face, the fact that the fact that they're seen as this moneyed club now, but they are also in the relegation zone. They need so many players. Clubs know they need so many players. There's hostility from other Premier League clubs. There's hostility from European clubs about the fact that Newcastle have money as well. There's so many different challenges facing the owners, and so it's harsh in many ways to judge them on this month. But equally, this month in the transfer market will determine whether they stay in the Premier League or not. And so that is when I think fans will start to make more of a judgment of how they've been so far.
It's a good job that His Excellency was actually there the other day, so he could see with his own eyes what needs to be done here, because it needs money, and it needs a lot of money. And
now,
as you just said,
it needs money now.
And as you just said, the price is going to be more expensive for Newcastle because of all of these different factors. Do you think that we're going to see Newcastle spending do you think they will end up spending 100 million plus in this window, Chris?
Well, I was surprised last week when it was confirmed to me that I thought that they were looking for, the Botman was their top target, and then someone like Diego Carlos was a backup option. But then it was made clear to me that actually they would ideally like both, which I was surprised by, because that will take a substantial amount of money. And when the takeover first happened in the immediate aftermath, there was a lot of conversations that I had suggested Newcastle may spend 40, 50 million this January window. But I think because the position has become so precarious in the meantime, and because the reality has dawned on them as to how expensive this window is going to be, I do think they will spend more money. I don't know exact figures, and I think it will depend on what they manage to find who is available in the transfer market, what they actually need to pay for players, and whether they can pay for them. But ideally, they would like about 6 signings by then. Certainly 4, but up to 6 signings. They've brought in Trippier, but they want 2 centre-backs. They want a left-back, ideally. They want at least 1 midfielder, and they want at least 1 forward. So that is going to cost a lot of money. If they're going to sign a forward permanently, the likelihood is, even if they're very average, they're going to cost a lot of money, because they're the most difficult to prize away at any time, never mind in a January window. So I do think they will spend. I think it'll be in the tens of millions. I don't know exactly what figure it'll go towards, because I don't think they know yet, because the situation is fluid and is changing given the difficulty of the January window and just seeing who is available. I do think they will also make loan signings, but as is the case almost every January, and as I was told a few weeks ago, the likelihood is that loans will become more likely towards the end of the window, because then it gets to a stage where clubs who want to sell their players realise they can't fully sell them, so maybe they will accept a lower wage payment for a certain player who they can offload towards Newcastle. So the likes of the players who they're being linked to are on silly money. They're not going to pay the silly money, those wages, but if they can pay a proportion of the wages, which is not completely beyond their own wage structure towards the end of the window, and they're in positions that they need, and they see them as being someone who can strengthen them, I think at that stage they may look more seriously at those sorts of deals.
Do you know who's actually in charge at the moment of doing the negotiations and everything? Because presumably Lee Tranley used to do that. It seems to be that maybe Amanda Staveley and Mehrdad Gudussi are doing that at the moment. Is that your understanding?
So Charnley was previously basically the lead negotiator at Newcastle. He did a lot of the different... He was involved in the negotiations through Unai Emery, and then bringing Eddie Howe as well, because that was before he actually left as managing director in November. But going at this window, a lot of it has been done hands-on by the British-based elements of the ownership. So that is Amanda Staveley, Mehrdad Gudussi, and Jamie Rubin. But they've also been receiving advice and given certain parameters to Nicky Hammond, as my understanding, to be able to do a lot of that as well. As then that he's there to basically say this is how contract negotiations should go. This is the sort of market value for it. This is the way that you engage with agents, and all those sorts of different technical advice. So it's a mixture of that. And in terms of who's selecting the players, Steve Nixon the head of recruitment who was there previously, has identified a lot of the players, the vast majority of them, albeit he's been able to sort of reassess some of the lists that he had previously. Now that in theory Newcastle can go for a higher caliber of player than maybe he was allowed to previously. And then Eddie Howe is being consulting him on that list. I mean, Trippier was very much Eddie Howe led, but the rest of the players that sort of going for have been presented on a list from Nick. A majority of them being presented on a list from Nixon, and then Howe's given the say-so for them to go for certain players. But Howe was interesting on Friday that he said that it's a very much a collective approach, and that although he will take all responsibility for anyone Newcastle sign, he was sort of coying whether he was told saying he had the final say. And where I think he's come from there is that he does ultimately have the final say on who comes in, but it's also dependent on who he can be presented with in terms of who becomes realistic. We had the same sort of situation with Rafa Benitez, only on a sense of he was given the final say at Newcastle United, but behind the scenes he would always be angry about the way that was presented, because it also depended on which players the club were willing to go for. And so his top targets, he would have the final say on all the players. But if they take the 8th player on the list, Benitez has had the final say on it, but was it the player he wanted? No, it wasn't. Slightly different with Howe, and it's more which players are attainable rather than him not being able to, being told you can't sign X, Y, and Z. That's going to be because of reasons that he's unable to come to Newcastle or he's too expensive, rather than, no, you just can't go and sign him.
I remember watching a documentary once, and it was about Chris Waugh when he was at Sheffield United in the January transfer window. And there was also the Sunderland Till I Die documentary, and it had the January transfer window. And it just looks like an absolute nightmare. It's like you've got agents ringing people, you've got other people who aren't even involved ringing up. And it just seems like the whole thing is so complicated and so convoluted. So when you've got fans saying we need to get players in now, why have we not got deals lined up straight away? You can just get a sense of how complicated it actually is, especially with those other factors you were talking about before there, Chris.
Oh, it's even at the best of times, particularly in January, it is chaos, and you have what you've got to remember with Newcastle's consortium as well, because there aren't a CEO or a director of football or anyone who's in some clubs. You even have specific people who are tasked with contract negotiations. That is their one job. At the very biggest clubs, that is their one job. Because Newcastle don't have that structure in place, you have so many different elements of the consortium who are all getting advice from different people, and they're all being offered players from agents who they know from different elements. So that makes it even more complicated, that you have all these different strands trying to work together without that sort of centrally focused structure that ideally you would have in a football club. And yeah, so it is very, very complicated. And ideally they would have had one or two more in by now, but it's not for lack of trying. And I will reiterate that the club are trying to bring in players, and I do believe they will bring in players, hopefully in the time for Norwich. My understanding is that basically the message behind the scenes over the weekend was that minds have been focused, and that really, if Newcastle have to pay a little bit over the odds, they're not going to go silly, but they may go a little bit beyond what they thought they were going to do previously, just because they have to get these players. And if they pay a little bit over the odds for players now, but that keeps them in the Premier League, in the long run, that saves them money, because otherwise they're not only going to lose money from going down, they're going to have to then build a squad to come back up before building a squad to try and get higher in the Premier League.
And I'm assuming this month that initial decision-making process where it seemed like things had to go back to Saudi, is that being kind of shelved a little bit for now? They've given parameters for them to work within, but they don't have to go to them and say, can we spend an extra 3 million here or an extra 5 million there or whatever?
Well, I haven't had full clarification on this, but the way it's been sort of presented to me is there was sort of a framework of a budget or financials that Newcastle's British-based owners could work within as to go and make signings this January. And that so it wasn't that every single individual decision necessarily had to go back to Saudi Arabia. I think that ultimately the PIF still do have the final say, and I think Al Rahman being there on Saturday was important, and the message come back from him now is, right, go and do some of those deals, and so that may even free up some more funds. I don't know that for certain, but that's just my sort of reading of the situation as to what might happen. So yeah, it seems to be a bit more of a streamlined structure than it was previously, when a lot of decisions, certainly over the manager and getting rid of Steve Bruce and the like, was having to go back to Saudi Arabia, and it became a very, very laborious process.
It's crazy that only 6 months ago we couldn't afford Chowdhury on loan, and that we've had these years of quibbling over a couple of $100,000 for Debussy all those years ago. It's just crazy that we're sitting here now in this situation with all this money.
Yeah, we've got to. I think we've got to go for it. I mean, like Chris said, an extra. Who are we to say we're just going to spend millions of these guys' money? But an extra 3 or 5 million here might get you 3 or 4 extra points that might keep you up in the meantime. So if we get that signing in before Watford, for example, if we get a striker and who starts on the weekend, who scores on the weekend and wins the game, that's 3 points. It puts us ahead of Watford. That could be crucial when it comes to the end of the season. So, I mean, there's going to be a Newcastle tax because of everyone knows we've got to pay for these players. Everyone knows we've got the money and we're desperate. But at least for the first 2 or 3 signings from now, I think they're going to have to just go for it.
It's a big week, isn't it? It's a huge week. Like, I mean, Watford's a big game, but leading up to it, I think this is where we'll see a little bit about the owners as well. I know they're trying, and Chris, like everyone has been reporting that they are really trying to get signings in, but it could be a monumental week for us as a club to be able to get 2 or 3 signings in and get the win at Watford. It could catapult us to the next for the rest of the season. So, yeah, it's interesting. It's a good time, and I'm sure your phone is going nuts right now.
It is, yeah. There's messages popping up all over the place. So I'm just there. It's chaos, but it's good in a good way. Hopefully it result. But it's been a complete sea change in terms of the pace of usually January window for the first 2 or 3 weeks. I know it's my time off. I mean, I've had my customary. I'm going to have my customary FA Cup 4th round weekend off as I usually do covering Newcastle United. But in terms of transfers, it's very, very different.
Yeah, because even Everton and Southampton won their games, didn't they? So those games can't be rescheduled to that weekend.
Yeah, it will be free, yeah.
I was just going to say to Chris, I'll put him on the spot, and which deal's next? Who comes through the door next?
Well, they're certainly pushing for a striker and a centre-back by Saturday if they can. I mean, Botman is their top target, but he's proven very difficult to prize away. I think we're getting to the stage where they may just decide to walk away from that and move on to someone else if Lille just won't countenance a deal. I find it interesting that Monaco, Badisil seems to be the next target they're looking at as a left centre back. He's going to cost a heck of a lot of money as well, but maybe they just value him slightly high. I don't know exactly what the logic is there behind that, but that seems to be where they might go next for him. Striker-wise, they're casting the net far and wide. There were a lot of reports yesterday about them being interested in Chris Wood at Burnley. My understanding is they are, but he's one of many, was how it was described to me, and they're just casting the net to see who's available. So I can't give you a specific name because I don't know, and I don't think they know. Well, it may have, in the course of the last few hours, that may have changed. But as of first thing this morning when I was speaking to people, I don't think they yet know exactly what's going to happen. They're pushing for various signings, and I do think that centre-back and striker are the 2 priority positions, but I can't tell you exactly who that'll be.
And I'll put my reputation up to the guys on our chat because I've got a couple of contacts around, and I heard the name Morelos from Rangers. So hopefully that comes because it'll give me a bit of credence in the group, I think.
Well, he's someone I've watched for a long while. I haven't heard strongly that, but I haven't heard otherwise. So let's wait and see. But he's definitely someone I've watched for a long while. So,
Chris, we're going to let you get away, and you can go and ring Sven Botman and tell him to come to Newcastle now. That's your job for the day. We'll let you reply to some of your messages there. But thanks very much for coming on. If you can get your bosses to pay for you to come over to Australia, we'll do a live pod sometime. That'd be good.
I'd love to do that. Yeah, I should push for it.
You've just missed the Ashes, but it wasn't really worth watching that anyway. No. So don't worry about that.
It was brilliant.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter at Toon Under Pod, and visit our Facebook page and visit the website toonunder.com. We'll be back for a preview of the biggest game of the last 50 years, Watford, in a couple of days' time. Thanks very much again, Chris. It's been a pleasure, and we'll speak to you soon.
Cheers. Guys.